All right. Well, thank you very much, Rich. I appreciate it. And thank you to everybody that's come on the Zoom today. I know you guys have had a lot of Zoom time over the last few months, and but we really appreciate your support of the department, your support of our research and the things that we're doing. And we just want to share some of that research with you today and give you a chance to see some of what we're doing. Chelsea is a PhD student here in the department. She's going into her third year, originally from Paris, Texas. And so she has been working with me on some of these projects, and she's going to talk to you about her research today, and then also about some future research that we're going to be working on over the course of the next year. We'd love to take your questions. It's if you're wanting to ask questions during the session, we'll try to keep track of the chat box, but otherwise we are happy to answer them at the end. So just jot them down and ask us at the end if you want to, okay? So I will start by going through real quick our definitions of leasing arrangements. We have our traditional leasing arrangements, which are crop share, where we consider the landowner and the tenant share both the crop and some of the expenses. Typically in Kansas, we're going to share nitrogen, we're going to share some of our chemicals, and we may share seed depending on the crop. A net share arrangement is a little bit different, where you share the crop but not the expenses. So if 1/3, 2/3 crop share is typical in your area, then a net share is probably going to be only sharing maybe 20 to 25% of the income, because you don't share any of the expenses as a landlord. And then there's the fixed cash rent payment, which is again pretty self-explanatory. It's a single amount that's paid either in 1 or 2 installments during the year. And so those are our traditional ones. And then the hybrids are flex leases, which we don't have as many of, but we do see them around. We've had a lot more interest in them lately. So there is some interest in doing flex leases to sort of mitigate the inflexibility of a fixed cash rent, but to also mimic some of the benefits of a crop share. Crop share leases, farmers and landowners share the risk. They share production risk, commodity price risk, and input price risk. They also tend to make their management decisions jointly. And technology adoption, such as switching to no-till, may change the arrangement or the percentages depending on the situation. A fixed cash lease, the farmer takes on the majority of the risk because payments are made regardless of production prices or costs. And management decisions typically don't involve the landowner as much, and so sometimes communication levels are lower. And I've said this through a lot of years, talking about comparisons between the two, and never really had any data to back it up. But I do have some data from the survey that is the basis for the research that Chelsea's going to talk about here in a few minutes. And what we see here is that if you're looking over here in the category of 5+ times per year, so the marker here is less than once a year, once per year, 2 to 4 times a year, or 5+ times per year that you talk with your tenant. You can see that on the crop share side, we've got a little more in the 5+ category. So a little more communication on that crop share, because you're talking about, what kind of chemicals you're applying, how the crop is going. And then you have a lot more in the once per year on the fixed cash, where we have sort of the joke is that you write the check and you drop it in the mail with the Christmas card, and that's your communication. So it's kind of the joke with the fixed cash leases. But it's pretty interesting. This survey that we've sent out, we talked to both landowners and tenants through the survey, and it gave us the opportunity to get some information from both sides of the arrangement. So this is some of the information that we've gotten. Flex leases are usually split into a fixed cash component and then a component that flexes on production, marketing, or revenue. They can be really customized to an operation and be very good, but they also can be very complex, and so a little bit more challenging to negotiate, and also a little bit more challenging for people to follow along with why they're flexing the way they are and where that information comes from. So we see fewer of them around the area. Here you can see in the Great Plains, according to USDA, we're 64% cash, 25% share, and 5% flex. And actually in Kansas, according to our survey, we have a lot more share than we do fixed cash leases statewide. Now that varies with portion of the state, but one of the things that you'll notice is that flex leases make up a pretty small percentage of our overall leases. If I were to look at the Midwest states, you would see even more cash lease. I think those are around 72% for cash leases. So there's been a movement away from crop share in the Midwest, but in the Great Plains, where I think weather is still a pretty big issue for production purposes, we still see a lot of crop share. Which makes this research pretty interesting because we've got a good mix of both the cash and the crop share leases that we can use. Now here's something that I wanted to show you. I've got to move something here. Okay, is trends in leasing arrangements. So we may think that it's a stagnant thing when it comes to the proportion of leases that are a crop share versus cash lease, but it's not. Since the early 2000s, we've seen an upward trend in the use of fixed cash leases. You can see that there's a difference between the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state, where the western part of the state still has more crop share than the eastern part of the state. But what I thought was pretty interesting was Leah Sodal was doing these surveys, and she did one in 2011 was the last one on the chart, and then they did another one in 2016. And we actually saw a drop statewide in the use of fixed cash leases. So we went from 35% fixed cash leases down to 29.8%. And what that tells me is that we've got some flexibility in terms of what kind of lease we negotiate between landowners and tenants, that it's not always fixed, that there is some movement between types of leases between two landowners and a tenant. Now, why would we see a decline in the percentage of fixed cash leases? Well, one argument that can be made is just the increase in volatility of profits during that period, and a movement by farmers or a push by farmers to move back to crop share, where they're able to share some of that volatility, especially in prices and production. So this kind of leads us into the next part of our presentation, where we want to start asking questions about the lease arrangement that's chosen and whether or not risk affects that choice of leasing arrangement. So risk aversion is definitely an issue. You can pick which side of the lease that you're looking at and whose risk aversion you're talking about. For farmers, crop insurance has reduced some of the production risk, and so that has allowed them to maybe take on more fixed cash leases than they would have otherwise. But landowners, of course, some of them very much want guaranteed income, especially if they're retired and this is part of their fixed income in their later years. Well, their risk aversion would be that they wouldn't want the ups and downs from a crop share arrangement. So you can see them pushing towards different leasing arrangements. Then with transaction costs, that's another thing that we look at, where maybe some people have taken on fixed cash leases because landowners are becoming generationally and geographically removed from farming. And so the idea of being able to have conversations with a landowner in a crop share, where you're putting on different chemicals, putting on different fertilizers, sharing different yield outcomes, might be a little more challenging than just being able to write them a check. And then production management with multiple leases and landowners. As our farms become bigger, we take on more leased land, which means we're taking on more landowners. And that ability to communicate directly with each of those landowners becomes more challenging in a crop share arrangement. So fixed cash leases can be more attractive. So these are just some issues that we've sort of discussed over the last few years with producers and talked about, and with landowners, talking to them about which kind of leasing arrangement they choose. And obviously we don't have a preference for one or the other, because I think that it depends on what your situation is and what your preferences are for those leasing arrangements. But we have a unique situation that I'm going to let Chelsea talk about in Western Kansas, and that we based this survey on as given us some motivation for this research project. So I'll just let Chelsea talk.
Okay, so as most of you probably know, Western Kansas sits on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is one of the largest in the world. Currently, water extraction is outpacing the recharge of that. And while technology has helped, there are certain government interventions that are being put in place, such as groundwater management districts that are overseeing counties with different LEMAs, which is a self-limiting program that is a local enhanced management area. And these are basically counties or ground management districts in which they're limiting how much water can be pumped out of that county. Currently, there are about 18 counties in Kansas that are a part of a groundwater management district that either has an active LEMA or is in the process of getting a LEMA. It also should be noted that nearly half of Kansas farmland is rented by farmers from other landowners, which brings us to the motivation of limiting groundwater usage may increase variability in yields. That's what we expect. So our research question is, does the increase in the riskiness of yields and profits affect the contract choice between landowners and tenants? We're not going to get too deep into literature review for this, but most of the literature follows a risk-sharing model of contract choice that use a CV or a coefficient of variation for crop yields at the county or state level, which basically says greater risk increases the use of crop shares. Within the literature review, it should be noted that it's always from one side of the problem, either the tenant side, the landowner side, or they've made an assumption that lumps them as the same level of risk, such as Allen and Luck. They said that landlords are mostly retired farmers, which we wanted to note is not an assumption that we make in our model. But then there's also mixed empirical results. Brian, Deaton, and Wiersnick in 2015, and then Fukunaga and Huffman in 2009, both had very similar models, but neither one, they each had conflicting results, either in line with the risk sharing model or not. But we want to emphasize that they didn't have the data available to do both the tenant and the landowner side, which is where we try to come in at. Our contribution to the literature being that we find a direct measure of risk aversion by both the tenant and the landowner, which allows us to control for preferences regarding risk of, again, both of those parties, while still controlling for risk through a crop-specific CV that does support that risk-sharing model. I won't go too in depth on the models. This is just some of the theory behind what we wanted to set up the problem as. But what I want to emphasize on this is we used a utility model, which is basically someone maximizing their utility is maximizing their happiness, whether their happiness is measured in profit or anything like that. But we do want to specify that Dr. Taylor talked about flex leasing, but our options were only a fixed cash rent or a crop share were the only two options tenants and landowners had. This gave us, again, those two problems, which you don't see often in the related literature, because, again, they either made the same assumption that they have the same risk, or they chose either the tenant or the landowner side of the problem, where we try to do both. But this is just basically saying that each one will maximize their utility given their preferences for either fixed cash or crop share. When you solve both of those problems together at the same time, you're giving these stylized facts or things that we hope to expect. And you'll hear me say these a couple of times throughout because these are really the things we wanted to emphasize. But if the tenant is more risk averse than the owner, so the tenant is less likely to want to take on more risk, the optimal contract is most likely to be the crop share. If the owner, however, is more risk averse than the tenant, an increase in the profit variability would increase the likelihood of that optimal contract being the crop share contract. And then finally, if the optimal contract is the fixed cash rent, an increase in the profit variability decreases the amount of the optimal fixed cash rent available. So these are things that we want to keep in mind as we go through. The data of this, it's the survey that was sent out. It was a landowner specific survey and a producer specific survey that was sent to the producers, and then each producer was asked to send it to their own landowner. And if they had multiple landowners, just their largest leasing landowner. All in all, we had 339 observations. We matched landowners with tenants, which, if we go back to that related literature, is a unique attribute of this study and of this data available to us. It's something that those in those related literature couldn't put in their model because they didn't have that paired data. So our final sample consisted of 133 pairs of tenant and landowners. And then in addition to create that CV or the output variability, we use NASS survey data on crop yields at the county level in Kansas to create that proxy variable. Our empirical approach had the goal of, again, we want to link that farmland rental contract to both the variability of output, but then also the risk preferences of the tenant and the risk preferences of the owners. So we identified 3 main crops to measure that output variability: corn, soybeans, and wheat, and we'll see in the descriptive statistics later that those were the 3 most common. We used that coefficient of variation of yields was, again, based on that NASS data over 15 years of the crop from the county where the field of the tenant was located in Kansas to get that output variability. We also, in that survey, there was a question that asked both the landowner and the tenants to self-assess their level of risk. So it was a 10-point scale, with 1 being completely unwilling to take on financial risk, and then 10 would be willing to take on any and all financial risk. We did 2 different models where one is on that full 10-point scale, and then another where it's categorical. So basically we split them into sections of risk averse being less than 5, which they're not willing to take risk. Risk neutral is 5 or 6, and then risk loving is greater than 6. The model we used was a logit model, which basically just helps predict probability of which crop share they'll choose. And again, it uses those 3 variables that we've talked about of the variability of output and then tenant and owner risk preferences. But again, I want to emphasize the expectations of this model along with our stylized facts. Again, we expect that the more the owner is willing to take risk, the fixed cash rent is less likely. And then the more the tenant is willing to take risk, the fixed cash rent contract is more likely. And then lastly, just the variability of output should be negatively correlated with the probability of fixed cash rent if you don't take into consideration the risk preferences. To go over some of just the data in general, we had about 43% of those that were surveyed used fixed cash. On average, owners were slightly more risk averse than tenants, as you can see in that 6.7 and that 7.08. Corn was the most grown crop at 42%, with wheat and soybeans following, which is about what we would assume in Kansas. We also want to make sure that we had a full range representative of Kansas. So if you see in the bottom, South Central was our most represented in Kansas with 26%, and the least representative was Southwestern Kansas with only 6%, but we do feel like we had a good range of across the entire state of some survey respondents. So this gets us to our results of, again, just to think about those stylized facts and our expectations. We did find that they were consistent our empirical findings were consistent with those facts, that the more the owner was willing to take risk, that fixed cash rent was less likely. The more the tenant was willing to take risk, the fixed cash rent was more likely, and then that variability of output was negatively correlated. Implications when you take into account the case of irrigation and these water restrictions, we're assuming that the variability increases with the irrigation restriction. We expect more crop share contracts as we go forward. As you have more variability in yield, you'll have more variability in profit. And so you expect more of those crop shares to help mitigate some of that risk. The baseline level of the variability in which crops will dictate the degree of probability changes. So it's just some of the things to think about in the future. And then we also wanted to emphasize that this did show that both the tenant and the owner's risk preferences play very vital, important roles in the crop or in the contract choice decision.
Yeah. One of the things I'll say about this research, if you go back to the beginning when I said that the percentage of fixed cash leases has actually declined since 2011, that's a change that it's hard for us in this particular research to say which is going to be more important, the increase in variability due to an irrigation restriction, or the change in preferences of landowners and tenants given change in price volatility or something like that. So we can't necessarily predict whether profit variability is going to, we see which way it's going to drive things, but if preferences of landowners and tenants change, that may drive the results in a different direction as well.
Which brings us to our future research of some of the things that I'm wanting to do on top of what's already been done. In that survey, a question was asked of, who do you rent to? What do you take into consideration when you rent to somebody? Are you more likely to rent to a family member, or is it the rental rate being offered as the most important thing? And the results showed some pretty interesting things of that family consideration was one of the highest reported, with reliability of the farmer being around second, and things such as environmental stewardship and the rental rate were not often the most important aspect of who to rent to, which we found interesting. And especially what we want to focus on is, does age and experience, if rent is not the most important, if that nominal value is not the most important, then what is, and can we put a value on that? So renting to young and beginning farmers, we want to offer up a question. You don't have to answer it out loud or in the chat, but just think about it. So you currently get $100 an acre for your land. A 30-year-old farmer offers you that same $100 an acre, and a 60-year-old farmer offers you $110. Who do you rent to and why? The thought behind this being, you know nothing about the 30-year-old farmer or the 60-year-old farmer. Is that extra $10 an acre enough to make you switch? Or who do you choose and why?
No, go ahead.
Oh,
okay. I clicked, sorry. Okay.
So experience versus transparency comes into play. You know nothing about that 60-year-old farmer. The 30-year-old farmer could have been somebody that's been farming their entire lives, where the 6-year-old is someone who just recently switched in, and experience is not equal with age. So does experience play a larger role than transparency? Would you rather take a $10 discount because you know that 30-year-old has experience and they're transparent with that? Or would you go with that 60-year-old who doesn't have the experience, but maybe you think the $10 is worth it?
I got it.
But this brings an interesting area that we can hopefully measure this social capital. And basically social capital are these special characteristics or things that don't typically have a nominal value, such as knowing them, knowing who they've worked with before, knowing things about them. Does that play a more important role than the value that you may be getting?
This question was posed to a focus group in Kansas City, Missouri. We worked with another extension ag economist from Missouri, and we got together a group of about 10 landowners. And when we asked them this question, it was interesting because at the beginning of the focus group, we actually got on the conversation of renting to young and beginning farmers, and they all said, oh yeah, we're really interested in giving people a start, and it's important to us that young farmers get the opportunity to farm. But then when we posed this question to them, they made some assumptions about the experience level of the 60-year-old farmer and the 30-year-old farmer, and about half of them took the $110 from the 60-year-old farmer, even though they had all sort of nodded their head and said, yeah, we care a lot about the young farmers. So it's interesting when you ask these types of hypothetical questions as to what kinds of answers you're actually going to get. And we did it with clickers, so they didn't have to identify who they were, so they did it anonymously, and we got a different answer than when we were talking about it as a group.
Along those same terms are who, in your opinion, has more power in negotiating lease terms, the landowner or the tenant? And in that same day, in that same focus group, we asked them with clickers, and the results were 100% of them said that they thought that the landowner had more negotiating power. Should be noted that this was a focus group entirely comprised of landowners.
Yeah, but we've gotten these results from mixed groups as well. So this tends to be the answer, and it's really interesting, especially when you consider that.
Well, so when it comes to negotiating power, it's who has the upper hand on the other, right? So farmers and producers tend to have the better information. You know your rental rates, you know the rental rates of those in your area, given if there's irrigation, if there's not, given if there's water restriction, if there's not, all these different things through coffee shop talk and through just general knowledge. You also, farmers tend to know what the prices have been, where they should maybe be going, along with advancements in technology and yield increases and government programs of, is this crop going to be subsidized this year, is it not, different things like that. So they have this vast amount of knowledge, and not saying that landowners don't, but landowners, well, they tend to have the land available for the producers to actually. So it's interesting to see if there's a difference in who has the actual negotiating power, if it is all landowners or if producers actually have a little bit more say in the matter than they think. Which brings us to the final of our final future research is we're hoping to get a survey out to both Kansas landowners and also of young and beginning producers that are we're gonna try and measure this social capital aspect of how much, when you're leasing to someone, how much value do you really put on knowing them as a family member, knowing somebody that has worked with them but you don't know them personally, just any and all these things. And then on the young producer side of it, asking them about your willingness to share information, because in that focus group, many of the landowners said, well, I'd like to help out the young guy, but I don't know anything about them. Who was his father? Who is he in financial debt? All these things like this. So would young producers be willing to share information to, one, gain access to the land, and potentially, is there a discounted rate? Is there more risk associated with young producers and landowners' size and like that? So we hope that if you fall into either one of these categories, if you're a Kansas landowner or a young producer, that if you get one of these surveys in the next few months, that you fill it out so that we can get you some hopefully interesting results.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we will open it up now. How are we doing for time?
Pretty good.
Doing all right. We will open it up. I'm going to try to open up the chat here so that I can see your questions. And you're more than welcome to talk to Chelsea and I about what we've been working on.
Go ahead, folks. We have plenty of time here for some questions, and there's some interesting stuff there. So, and I'll put in another plug after she said you're going to get this survey. There's some other surveys that come out to you, and I just really encourage you to fill those out. Coming from USDA and other places, this information is very helpful. We need it. You need it. There's a question.
Right. Is irrigation typically a shared expense in a crop share lease? Well, as I understand, In crop share leases, oftentimes the expense that the landowner is going to incur is going to be tied to what they own. So if the landowner owns the pivot and owns maybe the wellhead and pump, they're going to be responsible for some maintenance expenses on that. But if the tenant owns the pivot, and then they're going to be responsible for maintenance on that. So it kind of depends on what parts and pieces you own, and in terms of how the maintenance costs get split between the two. A lot of irrigation leases are cash leases, and that is because there's less volatility, there's less risk in an irrigated lease, or in irrigated production than there is in non-irrigated. So we tend to see more cash leases on the irrigated side. What is the average rate of return in the leases that you've reviewed? Well, it's all over the board because it's from across the state and across different crop rotations. If you're looking for lease information, USDA did put out last year county average lease rates, and those are available on Ag Manager. Maybe if Rich has a chance to put up a link to the Ag Manager webpage where those lease rates are, you can take a look at that. But for this particular survey, the rental rates were just all over the board, because
I think around 45 to 150 or so.
So
that
a big
some
range.
were irrigated, some weren't, different parts of the state and like that.
Yeah, so a big range. Thank you, Rich. So that's the link that you can go to and see where rental rates are, and that's at the county level. But you got to remember that even with the USDA numbers, rental rates can vary pretty widely within an area based on the productivity of the land, based on the specifics of the lease that's being negotiated. As we said, if it's an irrigated lease, who owns the pivot? There can be a lot of factors that affect proximity of that land to the operator's home place. Just lots of things that can affect it. 25% of harvest price times yield equals the landlord's share. And I believe for MSU Extension, I believe that is Michigan State. Is that correct, Roger? Yes. Okay. All right, so let's see. With a crop share lease and crop insurance coverage, how is that handled as to the cost of the insurance and payout? All to the tenant and landowner, or all to the tenant? All to the landowner split according to crop share split. So as I understand it, with the crop share lease, usually the landowner is going to buy their own coverage on their portion of the acres, so that if there is a claim, that you are going to get something that's in proportion to the acres that you are going to get. But if anybody else has other experience or other information, you're more than welcome to share it in the chat. That's the one thing about leases, is that while I've been listening to people talk about them for nearly 10 years, it doesn't mean that I've heard all there is to hear about leases in all the different ways. Okay, Matt, does the desire for relationships subdue the likelihood of cash rent auctions? So that's a good question. I think that relationships is a big driver for a lot of landowners, because they really want their land taken care of. And so that social capital that Chelsea was talking about, we've done other research on it, looking at essentially the trust, if you want to rename social capital as trust, with a tenant, and that you build that trust and that relationship up over time. And what we've seen is that it will substitute for the amount of money that is charged for renting land. So yes, I think that you could see it subdue the desire for a cash rent auction, because what people are saying is, well, instead of getting top dollar for my land, I want to get a good rate, but I also want to make sure that it's well taken care of. So I'm willing to take a little bit less in exchange for somebody that I know and trust that's going to take care of that land. So we have seen some empirical evidence of that, which would suggest that, yeah, it's going to decrease the likelihood of a cash rent auction. If you do haying, who pays to put hay in the first time? Oh gosh, okay. I don't know the answer to that one. I don't even have a good guess on that one. I guess what you're talking about is you've got ground that you need to plant a hay crop. Blue Valley Realty, you must be here in the Manhattan area, I'm guessing. I don't know if anybody else on the call has information on haying and putting in hay crop for the first time. I would have to guess that the landlord would probably have a big chunk of that because the hay crop is a perennial. And so that would be something that's an improvement to the land. But I don't know. Stump the professor day today. How much time do we have?
We're doing good.
We still have a few minutes. Nobody's answering that though.
I live out of state. Okay, well, there's a couple of different options. Some of the most basic are to actually advertise through the local paper. You're going to get some hits that way. What I would recommend is that you can also use a farm manager to recruit a new tenant, but you're going to pay that farm manager a percentage of your income for their help in finding you a new tenant. They're going to help you vet that tenant, and that's what I was going to say is if you advertise locally and you get some people saying yes, I'd be interested. If it were me, I would ask for essentially the equivalent of a resume or some references from that farmer for their farming experience and what they're doing, and try to vet them as best as you can, because that's the tricky part is that we tend to not go looking for a new tenant because it is kind of costly to us to go find a new tenant, but it's worth it if you feel like you can find a better relationship and have a better dynamic in that. How do I find a farm manager? How about you send me an email and I will let you know in your area where the local farm managers are. I think Rich will post my email here at the end if we don't do it any sooner. And you can ask for a copy of their crop insurance. Yes, that would be a way to see their productive potential that they could get on different land, keeping in mind that your land could be quite different in terms of its productivity from the ground that they farm. So they're going to have to kind of talk to you about what their farming philosophy is and how they're going to how they would farm your place given its unique characteristics. Anything you want to throw in here?
Not much, other than one of the questions asked earlier. One of the things we found interesting in the group was just how often I think some of those landowners wanted to meet with their tenants. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things asked earlier, like when you live out of state and some things like that, of just, it surprised me how often how hands-on some landowners want to be, which makes sense. It's what's happening with their own capital of their land. And then some landowners was, here's the check in the mail. I don't care anything as long as you're not ruining my land. I'll take the money. So I think one of the things I hope to find very interesting in the future research is just on that wide scale of I want to micromanage because it's my land, or I don't care as long as the money's in just how different some of the answers will be. I think it'll be really interesting. So just another plug to fill out any surveys if you're given any surveys.
Well, I know when we talk to producers and we talk about how you manage that relationship with your landowner, is recognizing that not all landowners are the same, and that some landowners very much want to be hands-on and want to be included in the things that are being taught, the decisions that are being made, and for them it's a big deal. Other landowners don't want to have that much to do with it, and you know, we have some other summary statistics we could have shown you from the slides, like things like percentage retired farmers. About half of the landowners out there are retired farmers, so they're going to have a different perspective than a non-farmer on how they run that place and their own personal experience with farming or grazing that land. Another one is whether or not you purchased the ground or you inherited the ground, which I also checked just to see if there was a difference in crop share versus cash lease, and there wasn't in terms of inherited versus non-inherited, or even in farmers versus non-farmers. But oh, we got some more comments from Roger. Irrigation pivots below ground equals landlord cost, pivots above ground equals tenant cost. Okay, so this is back to how you might share costs for irrigated ground, and it is probably more common than not that above ground is tenant and below ground is landlord. This is the energy cost. I'm not sure if that's a common one or not, but it would be definitely a negotiable point. And corn, soy rotation, all variable cost is tenant, including harvest and drying. Okay, so let me pull this down so I can read the rest of the, or not. Oh, gracious, hold on. I pushed the wrong button. There we go. It does depend. I mean, Northeast Kansas, we've got more corn soy rotation that we're doing, and but on irrigated, we're mostly in Western Kansas and South Central Kansas for irrigation. So I think some of those points are very very salient to the conversation, and whether or not they're reasonable or common is going to depend on the area. Okay, so from Cody, have you thought about looking at the percentage of rental land in Kansas is managed by farm managers, whether those are community bank, trust departments, or private managers? Will this increase with time as more land is owned by non-farming individuals? Okay, so no, we haven't necessarily we haven't even asked that question. We do ask who you rent from, if it's a trust or if it's a group of people or an LLC, but we've never asked, is the land run by a farm manager, which that's a good point. It would be a good survey question. To your question about whether or not this will increase with time as more land is owned by non-farming individuals, I was at a Women in Ag conference up in Nebraska this past winter, and was talking through all of these issues and talking about how they needed to be good landlords and understand what was going on. And finally somebody said, well, why can't we just hire a farm manager? And isn't that an option that we have? And it's like, yeah, that it really is. And for a lot of those women, that was their preferred way. They were willing to pay for the farm management cost in order to manage their asset. That to them was very appealing. I think you can manage a farmland on your own, but if it's too much time and expense for what your preferences are for managing, then paying that cost of having the farm manager could be a very good option. The other group that I find benefits from farm managers is groups of siblings. Because they tend to nominate one sibling to do all of the negotiating, and it really becomes a real stressor on that one sibling, especially if the group of siblings don't all have the same philosophy of what they're looking for in a tenant. So oftentimes when I see groups of siblings who want to hold on to the land and they don't want to sell it, looking at a farm manager as a way to manage that is something that is a good one. Okay, one of the biggest challenges as a supplier is the splits involved with share crop leases. Has there been any feedback from landowners with billing issues? Yeah, I've seen with billing issues. You have to take care of managing the books when it comes to figuring out who's paying for what and keeping track of that, which is why, getting back to one of my previous points, the more landowners you have, the less likely you are to do a crop share, because you've got so many different people to take care of and to manage. And so you really get into a situation where cash leases start to become attractive just for the purpose of bookkeeping and managing that type of work.